When the primeval waters finally receded, and the grandest cities of deep antiquity rose from the dust, did the Anunnaki gods simply abandon their grand experiment? Or did they quietly rewrite the rules? What if the celestial spark was never truly erased, but scattered forward into a new and far more difficult chapter of human history? One where an elevated thread of inheritance was woven through a secondary line of divinely chosen kings, demigods, and favored mortals. Figures who continue to reshape the earth, destined to carry the secrets of the old world across oceans and eons. Because here's the thing, in those earliest days after the flood, civilization did not simply stumble back into existence. It rebuilt itself with remarkable speed across the fertile valleys of ancient Mesopotamia, establishing kingdoms and hierarchies that would rule for millennia before the rise of Greece, before Rome, before anything that most people today would recognize as ancient history. And though many look at this period as the age when the celestial secrets of the Antediluvian world were finally lost, that reading doesn't hold up when you look closely at what the tablets actually say. The gods were still very much active. The highest earthly power was still concentrated in the hands of a select few, and those few were not chosen at random. Their bloodlines, their roles, and their authority reach back much further, to the very earliest foundations of Sumerian civilization, to figures whose actions would echo forward for centuries and rekindle the search for lost antediluvian wisdom across distant civilizations yet to come. What we're tracing here isn't the story of ordinary monarchs or the routine power struggles of societies entirely disconnected from the spiritual realm. It's something quieter and more extraordinary than that. It's the story of multiple distinct lines of a carefully preserved heritage, guided across the millennia to carry forward what the ancient texts describe as the supreme authority of the gods themselves. That's a bold claim, and it's one that the physical records, from clay tablets to royal inscriptions, king lists, and temple registries, actually give us something real to work with. So prepare yourself for the era we're entering, because here, the line between mortal reality and divine intervention was not blurred by accident. It was blurred by design. The oldest cuneiform records ever recovered make a declaration that surfaces again and again across different sites and different centuries, pointing all the while to certain figures in antiquity who were not regarded simply as powerful men. They occupied a space somewhere between historical reality and mythological exaltation. Demigods, semi-divine hybrid beings, mortals chosen and elevated by gods to guide all humanity through its earliest recorded dawn. And the social and spiritual hierarchy embedded in these texts is genuinely strange and genuinely fascinating, because it isn't presented as allegory, it's presented as administrative fact, as bureaucratic records set in stone, reflecting the breathtaking structure of a world where heaven and earth were inextricably bound to one another. And those records can be seen to this day, stored away in cool, dusty tablet rooms in the ruins of Nineveh, Uruk, and collections that were buried for thousands of years before 19th century excavators began pulling them out of the earth and shipping them to museums where scholars could finally begin the slow, difficult work of translating them. And among the most striking artifacts to emerge from that process is one you have likely already encountered: the Sumerian King List, a document that preserves a staggering and deeply strange record of royal succession, listing the kings who ruled before and after the Great Flood, along with the lengths of each of their reigns. And what it reveals is that the sacred authority of kingship, which had descended upon the first primeval cities of ancient Sumer, did not simply collapse when that era ended. It was established anew across the rising kingdoms of post-flood antiquity, city by city, dynasty by dynasty, in a pattern that reads less like ordinary political succession and more like a carefully administered inheritance. And beyond the King List, there are hundreds to thousands of temple registries and royal records from various cultures, tracking specialized advisors, high priests, and monarchs who claimed direct intellectual or genetic inheritance from the antediluvian world. These weren't fringe claims made by outsiders. They were inscribed by the very same institutions that held all the power as official records of legitimate authority. Inscribed in wet river clay thousands of years ago, these silent tablets preserve a trail of power that challenges everything we assumed about the origins of human civilization, the hierarchy of ancient societies, and the foundations of the beliefs that shaped everything to come. And then there are the biological anomalies. Because when you read the earliest post-flood dynasties in the Sumerian record, the reigns listed for the first few monarchs to reign after the Great Reset are not measured in years. They too are stretched across centuries, hundreds of years attributed to a single king before the next takes the throne, only to be shortened to normal time frames, no more than a few generations later. And this isn't unique to one document or one location. It appears consistently across multiple Sumerian sources in a pattern that gradually shifts over time, as the recorded lifespans slowly contract towards something approaching conventional standards. But whether you read this literally or as a coded symbolic system for displaying political prestige, the question it raises is real. Why would a civilization that was otherwise meticulous and practical in its record-keeping consistently attribute multi-century reigns to its earliest post-flood rulers? What were they trying to preserve in that image? Then there are other figures who deserve more attention, one of whom claimed no noble lineage whatsoever, no bloodline connected to the primeval era, yet he quickly rose to reshape the ancient world in ways never seen before, through what the texts describe as the direct favor and love of a particular goddess. Stories like these don't fit the expected pattern, and that's exactly what makes them worth examining more closely. And then there are the kings whose historical reality is no longer seriously in question. Men whose footprints archaeologists can trace in the actual soil of Mesopotamia, confirmed through inscriptions, building projects, and direct records from their own lifetimes. Yet some of these same men took a step that no ordinary monarch would take. They placed a sacred symbol, a divine marker reserved exclusively for gods, directly before their own names in official texts, declaring themselves living deities on earth, not as metaphor, not as poetic flourish, but as a literal statement of status written into administrative documents, carved into monuments, repeated across centuries. To the people who lived through this, these were not mythic allegories. They were literal, historical anomalies, written into stone by the very men and women who were there to witness them. If you're listening to this in the quiet of the night, drop a comment below and let us know where you are and what time it is. There's something genuinely comforting about knowing that listeners scattered across distant lands and completely different time zones are all settling into the same quiet journey through the forgotten echoes of human history. And if this Sumerian history for sleep narrative is helping you relax or drift off, consider subscribing to the channel. It helps support our efforts to keep bringing you these ancient stories each week and continue reaching others who are searching for the same calm place to relax and unwind. If you would like uninterrupted sleep and longer versions, those are available to you through the Legends of the Dawn membership. Now, let the modern world soften and fall away. Watch as the noise and the light of the present dissolve slowly into something older. Mud brick towers rising against a copper sky, whitewashed temple walls catching the last of the evening heat. The city of Kish standing as the supreme seat of earthly power at the dawn of a new age, millennia before the modern world ever took its first breath. The cool night air carries the faint perfume of sun-baked silt, cedar smoke, and the sweetness of date palms swaying along the Euphrates. And somewhere in the hum of that ancient world, in the lamplight of a temple room, a scribe presses a reed into wet clay and begins recording the names of kings who claim more than mortal inheritance. Step backward into the silent mist of deep antiquity, where the very first great kingdom of the post-flood earth is about to rise, and humanity's place in the cosmic order is about to be renegotiated under a mandate older than any of us have been taught to remember. And all the while, the scribe keeps his long reed stylus flowing, pressing a record into clay that refuses to let Enlil's fury be the end of the story, because according to the Sumerian King List, it wasn't. After the waters pulled back and the silt settled, and the land re-emerged, something happened that the ancient scribes considered worth documenting with the same gravity as creation itself. Kingship descended from heaven a second time. Not in Eridu, not in Shurapak, not in any of the great antediluvian cities, whose names the list had carefully preserved. The second descent landed in Kish, a city that would become the defining symbol of post-flood authority for every Mesopotamian ruler who came after. When later kings wanted to assert that their power was legitimate, that it traced back to the very beginning of the New World, they claimed ties to Kish, because to hold Kish was to hold the mandate, and to hold the mandate was to claim an unbroken line reaching all the way back to the moment the gods decided to reinstitute order over the earth. Kish itself was no small city-state. Emerging from the alluvial plains between the Tigris and Euphrates, it was a sprawling mud-brick city organized around temple complexes and irrigation networks that fed thousands of people. And the Anunnaki, as the texts describe them, were not silent observers of this rebuilding. They reinstated governance here deliberately, establishing a center from which human labor could be organized, canals managed, and the rhythms of temple worship maintained. There was a structure to all of it, intentional and divinely sanctioned. The city was less a settlement and more an instrument, placed precisely at the pivoting point between the old world and the new one. But the kings who first sat on that throne were not quite like the kings who would follow them. The Sumerian King List records the earliest rulers of post-flood Kish with lifespans that, though far shorter than their not-so-distant ancestors, still strain comprehension. Juka, the very first king of this new era, is credited with a reign of 1,200 years, the second, a king called Kulasina Baal, with 900. These extraordinary lifespans represent a fascinating transitional biological phase, the slow dilution of antediluvian physiology as pre-flood divine lineage mixed with mortals on Earth, a gradual dimming of the original celestial signal, century by century, generation by generation. But Juka was the king described as having descended directly from the heavens, in the same language the list used for the kings who ruled before the flood. He is credited with laying the foundational infrastructure of Kish, the canal systems and administrative architecture that made the city function at all. And then came Etana, the 13th king of Kish. He is described in the ancient texts as a shepherd chosen directly by the god Enlil to guide all the lands. But Etana had a problem. He had no male heir, no son to inherit the throne, no bloodline to carry the kingship forward after him. And in the cosmology of ancient Sumer, A dynasty without succession wasn't just a political crisis. It was a cosmic rupture. So Etana went looking for a solution in the only way the texts suggest was available to him. He appealed to the heavenly realm of the gods, praying to the sun god Shamash, who directed him to a remote mountain. And there, deep inside a pit, a great eagle lay broken. Its wings had been torn apart by a sacred serpent, punishment for betraying an oath the two creatures had sworn before the gods themselves. The eagle was trapped, starving, unable to fly. Etana found it there. He fed it meat and tended its wounds, sealing them closed with aromatic resins until its feathers grew back surely, but slowly. And when the eagle was healed, it offered him something in return. It would carry the king directly into the sky. What follows in the surviving fragments is one of the oldest recorded accounts of aerial ascent in human history, one rivaled only by King Enheduanna's ascent in the antediluvian days of Sippar. Etana climbed onto the eagle's back and held tight to its neck as they rose above the low-lying lands of the earth, watching the landscape below shrink smaller and smaller until the sea looked like nothing more than a small blue marble, and the fields like a single garden carved into dust. Together they passed through the heavenly gates of Anu, then Enlil, then Enki, ascending through layers of the upper realms in search of the Shamu Shah Aladi, the plant of birth, the sacred celestial substance guarded within the halls of the gods themselves, a thing that could, the texts imply, do what no earthly remedy could accomplish: open the way for an heir. The surviving clay is damaged at the crucial moment. We don't know definitively whether Etana reached what he was seeking, but history remembers him as the shepherd who ascended to heaven and consolidated all the lands. That phrase suggests he came back with something, and the Sumerian King List records successors to his throne, which implies the bloodline did continue. What that story encodes is worth sitting with quietly for a moment, because it isn't simply a legend about a desperate king and a remarkable bird. It carries a theological argument embedded in the oldest written layer of Mesopotamian thought. That divine kingship was not purely a matter of biology or direct inheritance. That there were moments when the continuation of a sacred line required direct celestial intervention. A literal journey into the upper heavens, a divine catalyst retrieved from the halls of the gods and brought back down into the mortal world. Etana's ascent wasn't an aberration in the system. It was the system revealing its own architecture, that the most consequential royal bloodlines were never forged by human hands alone, but renewed and activated through direct contact with the highest reaches of cosmic authority. That architecture didn't collapse when the floodwaters finally receded. It continued, just through different vessels than before. And while the new kings were rising from Kish, moving their courts to Uruk, then onward to rebuilding the cities and re-establishing the sacred institutions of old, they weren't doing it entirely alone. All the while, there was another group of figures moving quietly alongside them, not kings themselves, but something older than kingship. Distant relatives of the original seven sages, the Apkallu, who had guided the great antediluvian capitals of ancient Sumer before the flood came. Those original seven were never seen walking the shores of Mesopotamia again. That much is clear from the texts. But their bloodline, their genetic inheritance, had not simply vanished into the mud. It had passed forward. It had survived, embedded in a new generation of hybrid beings who looked nothing like their half-fish, half-human ancestors, beings who carried no obvious sign of what they really were. 4 sages emerged into the post-flood world, recorded in the cuneiform tradition by name. Nungal Pirigaldem, Pirigalabsu, and Lunana, 4 figures who stood between the divine architecture of the old world and the purely mortal world slowly forming around them. What makes Lunana particularly striking is what the texts say about him directly, not through inference, not through metaphor, but in plain cuneiform description. He is defined as being only 2/3 Apkallu, and that matters more than it might seem on first hearing, because it means the scribes who recorded this weren't simply writing mythology in loose poetic terms. They were making a specific genetic claim, a statement of inheritance, clearly indicating that the divine sages who came before the flood had at some point mated with mortal women, and that their offspring carried forward a diluted but still potent version of that original celestial biology. 2/3, not fully divine, not fully human, something precisely in between, enough to carry the knowledge forward, enough to serve as an advisor to kings who had descended from heaven's second gift to the earth. And physically, these post-flood Apkallu are depicted far differently from their ancestors. Eagle-headed figures, warrior-like in their proportions, nothing like the fish-cloaked forms of the 7 who came before them. The divine instruction had found a new shape to move through. But shapes change, and bloodlines dilute. That's simply what happens across generations when the divine mixes repeatedly with the mortal. And so, as the centuries passed and the dynasties continued their slow succession from city to city, the active presence of the 4 post-flood Apkallu themselves began to quietly fade from the record, into something seemingly far more ordinary. Their hybrid descendants grew more human with every generation, until the point came when the sages advising the king were no longer described as Apkallu at all. They were called the Ummanu, fully human scholars, scribes, and royal counselors who carried the ancient knowledge forward through sheer mastery of their intellectual inheritance, through study and transmission, through the written word pressed into soft clay. They were still understood to be categorically above ordinary citizens, not just socially, but spiritually, legally designated as gatekeepers of divine knowledge, using celestial mathematics and ritual precision to determine the will of the gods for the empire. The shift from Apkallu to Ummanu is one of the quietest transitions in the entire Mesopotamian record, and also one of the most significant. It's the moment when the direct biological chain from the gods finally completed its long arc into standardized human intelligence, when the wisdom became a discipline rather than a direct connection to the divine. But that connection still lived on, and it is reflected clearly in another figure who sits right at the edge of that transition. His name was Abanana, and he served as advisor to King Shulgi of one of the most powerful and deliberately self-mythologized rulers in all of Mesopotamian history. But Abanana was real. He appears in the historical record, and what he claimed about himself is the part worth looking at more closely. Because Abanana didn't simply present himself as a learned scholar or a capable court advisor. He claimed direct descent from the pre-flood Apkallu themselves, a living connection to the Antediluvian sciences, to the knowledge that had existed before the waters came. Whether that claim was literal, symbolic, or political is a question the tablets don't fully answer, but the fact that such a claim could be made in a serious administrative context tells you something important about how that culture understood the relationship between ancient wisdom and legitimate authority. The bloodline to the old world wasn't just mythology. It was currency. It was status. It was the act of keeping the gods' wisdom alive, and it kept circulating long after anyone might have expected it to stop. because the sages don't simply disappear when Mesopotamian civilization begins to fade. They reappear again and again, reshaped in later Jewish, Christian, and classical traditions, carrying entirely different names and presented with entirely different reputations. The wise civilizers who taught humanity agriculture, writing, and sacred law in the Sumerian texts become something far more troubling in later apocalyptic traditions. Scholars who have traced the structural parallel between the pre-flood Apkallu and the figures described in the Book of Enoch have noted a deliberate inversion. The same basic story, divine beings descending to instruct humanity before a great flood, but flipped in its moral perception. In the Sumerian record, the Apkallu are dedicated protectors and eternally wise teachers, gifts from the gods to help civilization take root. But in Enochic tradition, those same descending figures become the Watchers, rebellious heavenly beings whose hybrid offspring brought ruin and violence to the earth before the flood came to wash it clean. Even the terminology crosses over. Akkadian ritual texts describe buried protective figurines as masare, a word that translates directly as watchers, placed inside homes to ward off evil and guard the threshold, the same word. A completely different moral charge attached to it by the time it reaches Second Temple Jewish literature. What had once been a guardian became a corrupter, and what had once been deemed revered sacred knowledge became forbidden arts, lost for many ages in the sand-swept remnants of one of the world's oldest recorded civilizations, waiting for modern eyes to take a second look. And to really understand what happened to all of these figures, and to the knowledge they supposedly carried on long after the waters receded, because new seats of power had been created for a world that had been remade, not one that was forgotten, a world that defined their claim to power rather than being hidden from it. The governance structure that emerged in the post-flood era wasn't just about kings and armies, and at its center sat an institution that continued to claim a lineage older than the flood itself, long after we thought their wisdom had been lost. Remember the Antediluvian priests of old, the Baru? Throughout most studies, they are most strongly associated with the Antediluvian period. Specifically, their mythological origins under King Enheduanna of Sippar, who was said to have received the arts of divination directly from the gods Shamash and Adad, but that connection between the Baru priesthood and the gods was not simply a founding legend told around fires in later years. It became a professional credential sustained across millennia of documented history. Excavations at Mari and Sippar have pulled clay models of divination rituals from the earth, inscribed tablets used like training manuals, teaching younger priests the precise techniques passed down through the guild. They were structured, technical, and fiercely methodical. And the moment you understand that, the true scope of what the Baru actually were begins to settle in differently. By the time of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, somewhere between 911 and 612 BCE, thousands of years after their original guilds in Sippar had been placed in ancient memory, the Baru had reached the absolute height of their political influence. In the courts of kings like Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal, royal Baru priests traveled side by side with some of the greatest armies of ancient antiquity. They examined sacrificial animals like divine omens before military campaigns began. They submitted written reports to the king, interpreting the appearance of eclipses, the paths of shooting stars, the behavior of weather systems. What the gods were saying through the sky was their department, and no serious decision moved without their reading of it. 100 tablets, thousands of conditional statements structured as if then observations used to decode the precise messages hidden in the natural world. And throughout all of it, their claimed antediluvian origin served as a kind of professional certification. The wisdom was flawless, they argued, because it had not originated with men. It had been given before the flood, preserved through the disaster, and physically buried in the archives of Sippar until it could be recovered and carried forward. But the Baru and the Ummanu were not the only post-flood institutions carrying this weight. When kingship descended again at Kish, a second structure emerged alongside the centralized supreme authority of the Lugal. These were the Ensi, local priest-kings governing individual city-states. Figures like the rulers of Lagash and Their high duties were directly aided by the Sabra, the temple administrator who managed the practical functions of the sacred space. Only the Ensi answered directly to a supreme Anunnaki god, but within their own cities they held enormous authority. And they were not selected the way an ordinary official would typically be appointed. Sumerian texts describe the Ensi as being called by name, directly by the city's patron deity. Enlil might choose one man from the population of a city. Inanna might designate another. This was not a matter of lineage alone, though lineage still mattered enormously. It was direct divine election, and the texts frame it as exactly that. Ensi rulers would claim that they had been nourished with sacred milk of the gods by divine goddesses, and that this had given them extraordinary physical stature, unusual wisdom, and a quality of leadership that set them apart from anyone born of purely mortal circumstance. Gudea of Lagash is perhaps the most well-documented example of what this could eventually mean, because after his death, Gudea was actually given a form of minor divine status. His people offered sacrifices to him and directed prayers toward his memory, treating him not as a departed ruler, but as something closer to a local deity. The boundary between mortal and divine beings was, it seems, considered crossable under the right conditions. And then there is Enheduanna, daughter of Sargon of Akkad, appointed high priestess of the moon god Nanna at She is among the earliest named authors in recorded human history, and her hymns, particularly the exaltation of Inanna, reshaped the theological landscape of Mesopotamia in ways that scholars are still tracing today. She was not simply a woman in a religious role. Hers was one that carried enormous institutional power, and it was not accidental. It was carefully curated. This can't all just be mere coincidence, as many mainstream theories would like to maintain, because through these records, time and time again, we witness divine intervention directly from the Anunnaki, long after the floodwaters receded. And what you see across all of these figures and all of these institutions is a pattern, a deliberate, carefully maintained architecture of divine connection, extended across centuries. The flood did not erase the old order, it simply reorganized it. And those who carried the threads of antediluvian knowledge forward, whether through priestly lineage, divine election, or through the literal burial and recovery of sacred texts, they continued to shape the world in ways we still don't fully understand, carrying the torch of antiquity forward to new and brighter horizons. But believe it or not, that's not even the half of it, because from the early Sumerian city-states to their expansion across Akkadia, Babylon, and Assyria, we also witness something far more direct. Not the quiet nudge of indirect aid, not the slow transmission of priestly knowledge, but the gods leaving their impression in something far more intimate, in the blood itself, in our very own DNA, spawning some of the most remarkable figures in all of early human history, rulers who weren't merely chosen, rulers who were, by the reckoning of their own people, and their own records, something other than fully human. And what makes this genuinely difficult to dismiss is that these aren't figures from obscure corners of mythology. They hold a very real place in the historical record, which raises a question worth sitting with. If the texts we have are any indication at all, how far did those bloodlines actually run? We'll start with Enmerkar, the legendary founder of Uruk, one of the great early cities of Mesopotamia, who appears in the epic poetry of his era not as a man who seized power, but as a man who was directly selected for it. In the poem known as Enmerkar and the Lord of Aratta, he is described explicitly as the Lord chosen by Inanna in her holy heart, not metaphorically chosen, not symbolically anointed, chosen in the language of the text, and not for any ordinary reason. Because Enmerkar claimed a far more direct celestial lineage, he was said to be the literal son of Shamash, also known as Utu, the sun god. And here, his claim to rule Uruk rested not on military conquest or inherited wealth, but on a direct and personal relationship with the divine. The city was his because the goddess had looked into her heart and placed him there. That kind of language wasn't rhetorical flourish in Sumerian writing. It was a theological statement meant to be understood exactly as written. Then there is Gilgamesh, the fifth king of the first dynasty of Uruk, and one of the most well-studied legendary figures in all of ancient literature. His own texts describe him as 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, a measurement worth pausing on because it mirrors almost exactly the hybrid proportions attributed to the post-flood Apkallu sages. A surviving strain, perhaps, of the physiology that existed before the flood reshaped the world, a physiology clearly reflected in his tremendous stature. Interestingly enough, the ancients took meticulous care in recording his physical size and strength, and by any standard he is described in terms that suggest something far older than ordinary human inheritance, putting him at 11 cubits tall, which in our measurements equates to roughly 16 to 19 feet, or 4.9 to 5.8 meters tall, with a chest 4 cubits wide. The texts describe Gilgamesh as being perfect in strength, possessing raw superhuman power that allowed him to outmatch nearly any opponent. In his famous battle with Enkidu, they grappled so violently that the walls of Uruk were said to shake. The doorposts shattered. Still, Gilgamesh ultimately overpowered him. He wrestled and slaughtered the divine bull of heaven by grabbing it by its horns and thrusting a sword directly into its neck, a beast so massive that its snorts opened cracks in the earth that swallowed hundreds of men. He also fought and killed Humbaba, the terrifying supernatural guardian of the cedar forest. And in some versions of that myth, the sheer force of their battle flattened whole mountains. And at the heart of it all was his quest for antediluvian wisdom. His epic journey to find Utnapishtim, the flood hero, also known as Zuisudra, who was granted eternal life by the gods, was not a spiritual allegory in the way we might read it today. It was a search for the actual secrets of the world before the deluge, for knowledge that had been lost when the flood reorganized everything. And his later connection to the Nephilim tradition, the biblical figures described as the offspring of divine beings and human women, is noted by scholars who trace these parallel narratives across Sumerian, Babylonian, and Hebrew sources. The thread connecting them is consistent, and with it, so is the idea that certain individuals carried something far more ancient in their lineage. But the pattern doesn't stop with legendary kings. It extends forward into firmly historical rulers, who made their divine status an official matter of record. The cuneiform sign known as the dingir, a star symbol used strictly to denote a deity in Mesopotamian writing, was placed before the names of several historical rulers, not as a poetic honor, but as a formal designation. Among the most notable is Shulgi of who claimed to be the literal brother of Gilgamesh and the direct son of the goddess Ninsun. He didn't simply rule. He established active cult temples dedicated to his own living worship, and his reign was one of extraordinary achievement. He unified weights and measures across Mesopotamia, standardized a state calendar, rebuilt and extended road systems, and created way stations for travelers along major routes. He completed the great ziggurat of the massive stepped temple his father Ummanu had begun, raising it to its finished form. He also poured enormous energy into the scribal schools of the Edupa, revitalizing their curriculum and driving a period of literary preservation and literacy that historians now call the Sumerian Renaissance. A man who claimed to be divine and then spent his reign building the kinds of institutions that last for centuries. Naram-Sin of Akkad took that declaration even further. After a string of military victories that pushed his empire to its greatest extent, stretching from what is now Turkey and the Mediterranean coast, all the way down through Iran and toward the Persian Gulf, he formally declared himself the living god of his city, depicting himself in royal motifs wearing the horned helmet, the same helmet that Mesopotamian iconography reserved strictly for divine beings. And the victory stele of Naram-Sin, one of the surviving masterpieces of ancient sculpture, shows him crowned with those horns, scaling a mountain above his defeated enemies. It is both a military monument and a theological statement carved in stone. His grandfather, though, is perhaps an even stranger figure in the record. Sargon of Akkad founded the Akkadian Empire around 2350 BCE, and it stands as the first true multi-nation empire in recorded history. He unified the southern city-states of Mesopotamia, establishing Akkadian as the dominant regional language and building a political structure that had simply never existed before. Not at that scale. But unlike most traditional dynastic rulers of his era, Sargon did not begin with divine blood. His birth legend, preserved in texts that scholars have compared directly to the later story of Moses, describes a child born in secret to a high priestess, sealed into a basket of reeds with bitumen to waterproof it, and set adrift on the steady currents of the Euphrates River. He was then pulled from the water by a humble gardener named Akkad, who raised him as his own. He grew up working as a cupbearer in a royal court, not as a prince. And yet the goddess Ishtar, the texts say, loved him. That divine attention transformed everything. His rise to power was not legitimized by lineage. It was legitimized by direct favor from one of the most powerful female figures in the entire Sumerian pantheon. His established title of Shah-Ru-Kin translates to something close to true king, or legitimate king, a name that, in itself, acknowledged the unconventional nature of his claim. In Sargon's own official inscriptions, he described himself as the overseer of Inanna, the anointed of Anu, and the governor of Enlil, a man who may not have been born of direct divine inheritance by any measurable degree, but who had been personally selected by gods whose authority over earthly affairs never waned, even in the long years to come. And then there are the mysteries of Babylon, a settlement that began as little more than a minor town in what is now modern Iraq. But Babylon would quickly grow into something far larger, under a king named Hammurabi, who rose to power around 1792 BCE. He inherited a fragmented region still recovering from the collapse of the third dynasty of Ur. And what he built from that inheritance was one of the ancient world's most unified empires. The Assyrian shadow was already spreading across the north at the same time, yet Babylon held and grew and eventually came to define a whole era of Mesopotamian civilization. And right at the center of that era, there is an artifact that tells us something important, not just about law, but about who these people believed was really in charge. There, we discovered the Code of Hammurabi, composed around 1754 BCE. It is carved onto a basalt stone pillar that stands nearly 7 feet tall. You heard that right, 7 feet. And inscribed on the surface are around 282 distinct laws covering nearly every level of society and organized life, trade and wages, marriages and divorce, theft and punishment, the treatment of slaves, the rights of free citizens, the responsibilities of builders, doctors, and merchants. Punishments shifted depending on your position in society, with harsher consequences applied differently across the elite, the free, and the enslaved. It also established something like a minimum wage for various forms of skilled labor. For its time, it was one of the most detailed and far-reaching legal frameworks the ancient world had ever produced. But the way it came to exist, that part is even more striking than the laws themselves, because Hammurabi never presented the code as his own creation, a distinction that matters enormously because it reveals exactly how power was understood in this corner of the world, and how deeply the older threads of Sumerian belief were still running through Babylonian culture. Rather than claiming personal credit, Hammurabi thought of himself as an instrument, the designated agent of a cosmic plan that had already been set in motion long before he was born. The stone pillar opens with a mythological prologue written in his own words, and those words make the chain of authority unmistakably clear. The great gods Anu and Enlil, the sky god, father of all the Anunnaki and the god of wind and earth, had chosen the city of Babylon to be the ruling center of the world. They had called upon Hammurabi specifically and by name to carry that mandate forward. His task was to bring order to the land, destroy wickedness, and protect the weak from being taken advantage of by those with more power. And at the very top of that pillar, carved into the basalt itself, is a scene that would have been immediately legible to anyone who looked at it. Hammurabi stands before Shamash, also known in the older Sumerian tradition as Utu, the god of the sun and of justice. Shamash is depicted wearing a horned crown, with rays of light rising from his shoulders. He is handing the king a measuring rod and a length of rope. Seemingly simple at first glance, until you realize that both of these are ancient symbols of divine order, the right to build and to judge. The message of that carving was direct. These laws were not invented by a mortal ruler sitting at a desk. They were cosmic truths handed down from heaven itself. To violate one was not simply to break a civic rule. It was to offend the very gods who authored it, showing that the old structure, the one written into the tablets long before Hammurabi was born, was still fully intact. And those patterns don't stay confined just to Mesopotamia. They echo outward, into Egypt, into the mythological record of the biblical traditions, and beyond. And in both cases, they point back toward the same underlying obsession, the search for wisdom that survived the flood. Knowledge that predated and contained within it every ounce of information needed to fully restore the order of the world. In Egypt, there is the story of a man named Dedi. He appears in a text from the Old Kingdom period, described as a magician of sorts who had reached the age of 110 years. Pharaoh Khufu sought him out specifically because Dedi was said to know the location of the secret chambers of the sanctuary of Thoth, the god of writing and hidden knowledge. Those chambers, according to the story, held the instructions Khufu needed to construct his monuments at Giza, blueprints to the kind of engineering feats accomplished long before their empires were even thought of, indicating that even the design of the Great Pyramids was not invented by engineers working under the pharaoh. It was recovered. Retrieved from a repository of pre-flood knowledge that had been deliberately concealed and preserved across an enormous span of time, carried on by the kings, by the long lines of hybrid sages, priests, and seers, by the direct descendants of the gods themselves and those who somehow obtained their favor. And whether or not you take that story literally, the cultural logic behind it is consistent with everything we've been tracing. The most important knowledge, the most advanced wisdom one could ever hope to obtain, was antediluvian. The goal was always to reach back past the flood and recover what had been there before. A search that continues, even to this day. Then there is the figure of Nimrod. He appears in Genesis as a mighty hunter, a man of exceptional power who founded the cities of Babel and Nineveh in the land later associated with Assyria. Scholars have spent considerable effort tracing where that figure came from, and the most widely supported connection leads to Ninurta, the Sumerian god of war, agriculture, sacred law, and hunting. The linguistic shift from Ninurta to Nimrod is phonetically gradual enough to be more than credible. And the ruins of a major city known as Kalhu, which bore the name Nimrud in later periods, sat at the heart of Assyrian territory as a cult center specifically dedicated to Ninurta. Here the geography and the mythology collapse into each other. What the biblical tradition preserved as a legendary post-flood king building empires in the East appears to be a layered reflection of the very same priest-king archetypes that ran through Kish and Uruk, a hunter king, a city founder, a figure whose authority over the earth descended in some form from above, just like so many of them did. And so the story settles, the way all old stories eventually do, into something quieter than the events themselves. Picture the last light of day pulling away from the southern plains of Mesopotamia. The whitewashed walls of the ziggurats catch it for a moment, burning pale gold against a sky that deepens from amber into something richer, something the color of old copper, then indigo, then the deep and eternal blue of night. Down along the Euphrates, where the reeds grow thick and the water moves slowly, small fires begin to glow in open courtyards. The smoke rises straight up in the still air. The day's noise softens, and in city after city, from the sandy southern shores near the Persian Gulf to the folded ridges of the Zagros Mountains in the east, then northwest into the plains of Mari and the upper reaches of Syria out along the Levantine coast, and down to the very borders of Egypt, the same quiet descends. The same stars emerge. The same ancient sky spreads itself above all of it, unchanged and as unhurried as it always has been. And somewhere in the darkness of one of those early cities, in the Edubba tablet houses, rows of clay tablets rest in the cool air. They have been drying slowly the way clay does, holding everything inside them, the sacred names, the genealogies that stretched back to a time before recorded history, the star coordinates pressed in careful wedge marks by steady hands working in lamplight. Those tablets don't need anyone watching them. They simply hold what they hold, patient and still and certain, the way only something that carries the full weight of antiquity can be, celestial knowledge sealed in earthen forms, curing gently in the dark, and life goes on around them, just as it always has. The generations keep coming. Cities grow beyond what their founders imagined. Astronomers chart the movements of planets across centuries of careful records. Builders raise structures that take lifetimes to complete. Children are born into families that carry old names without quite knowing why those names feel important. The thread keeps moving forward, quiet and unbroken, even when no one is watching it closely enough to see. The gods, if they were ever watching, grow more distant with each passing century. Or maybe they don't. Maybe they simply become harder to distinguish from the sky itself, from the long sweep of seasons, from the way certain ideas keep returning to human minds in different places and different eras, as though something is still passing them forward. They wait in the stars, in the quiet underlying knowledge written inherently into all things. And all the while, the mortals of the earthly realm continue doing what mortals have always done. They gaze upward, they wonder, and they build higher. There's something deeply restful in that image if you let yourself sit with it. All those generations, all that time, the same night sky looking down on the first cities and on every civilization that came after them, even on this very moment, right now. The river still moves in the same direction it always has. The stars still rise and set in their old familiar patterns. And somewhere underneath all of it, running like a slow current through everything, is the accumulated weight of that much human memory, that much time, that much quiet continuation. It doesn't ask anything of you, it just keeps flowing. And if you let your thoughts grow soft around the edges and focus more on the space between, you might feel it, that slow and golden current, ancient and warm and completely without urgency, carrying you, unhurried, somewhere without boundaries or questions or the need to know what comes next, just the drifting itself. Through the deep celestial seas of the old world, in the feeling of being held by something much older and much larger than any single night. Let it take you. There's nothing left to figure out. Just the quiet. Just the stars, just the endless procession of the stars in the sky, held for eternity by the very intelligence from which they were first formed.